the Chinese government is taking notes, especially to the U.S. response in this conflict. The Biden administration sanctions have helped isolate the Russian economy. That's good, but it was reactive at best. We watched as Russia amassed troops at the border last fall, all the while claiming no plans for invasion, a claim parroted by Chinese officials as late as February 23rd even. And at the same time, all of this is happening with Russia and Ukraine, we see China's continued activities in the Taiwan Straits, and they're telling us that supporting Taiwan is, quote, dangerous, end quote, to our relationship. We must remain clear-eyed about who we're dealing with here. China must feel the pinch of its no-limit partnership with Russia. While the Biden administration eventually sanctioned Russia, it also unwittingly provided a means by which China could help Russia circumvent those sanctions. Let me explain. Last year, the Treasury Department bypassed Congress and approved a general allocation of International Monetary Fund special drawing rights, SDRs, sending Russia and Belarus more than $18 billion in de facto $18 billion in no-strings-attached liquidity. State sponsors of terrorism like Iran and Syria received billions more, by the way. Republicans warned that an SDR allocation ran counter to U.S. sanctions policy. As the Putin regime continues its assault on Ukraine, it is clear our concerns were justified. And yet even OFAC seeks to block Russia's access to foreign reserves. At the same time, our country allowed SDRs to become a lifeline that the Russians may exchange for Chinese currency, for the Chinese RMB. Now, U.S. officials have to ask foreign countries not to redeem the very same Russia SDRs this administration pushed for just a few months ago. This policy doesn't make any sense. That was a bad decision. And I think it's important that the public recognize, and this administration recognize, that Congress is a partner in this fight, this international fight that we have. It is the Treasury Department that has a duty to keep us informed. To date, we have yet to receive certain reports related to the international financial institutions under your remit. This includes policies regarding China, Taiwan, and efforts against terrorism financing generally. I appreciate the Treasury's work in terrorism and financial intelligence. It's good work. But here, too, the Treasury must respect the oversight of Congress, and it is simply unacceptable that Treasury officials have dodged public hearings for as long as they have. We have to work to ensure that we have maximum pressure on Moscow so that the Putin regime changes course in Ukraine. But at the same time, we cannot keep our eye off the challenge that China poses and the risks that a rising China poses to the stability of the world.
As you know, China has faced major challenges in its real estate sector, including debt problems at one of its largest developers, Evergrande. China's opaque lending abroad creates contingent liabilities of unknown size, and Chinese regulators have warned about a rise in non-performing loans. Beijing has also announced restrictions on private investment in news media, which would only tighten the Chinese Communist Party's control over information and make China's economy more opaque. In your view, Madam Secretary, which parts of the Chinese financial system pose the greatest risk to stability beyond China's borders? And what is Treasury doing in the FSOC, the Financial Stability Board, and elsewhere to mitigate this risk?
Well, I do think that there is significant risks in the Chinese financial system, and the property sector is an example of one where there are severe risks. And importantly, a slowdown in the property sector beyond its global implications would probably weigh on China's growth outlook, which would have impacts on its economic partners. And this is something we're carefully monitoring.
I think the government of China is watching us very closely. It's pretty clear that when Russian troops amassed on the eastern Ukraine border last fall, the administration lacked a cohesive strategy to respond. Many of us have warned that a similar situation is occurring between China and Taiwan. Now, for example, Chairman Xi has vowed to, quote, smash, end quote, any attempts at independence by Taiwan. We've seen an unprecedented incursion by the Chinese into Taiwanese airspace, including sending dozens of planes into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Has the administration issued a warning of sanctions or a threat of sanctions to Beijing to deter military action by China against Taiwan?
So clearly, the administration and the Treasury Department are opposed to any unilateral change in the status quo with respect to Taiwan. And we are working very closely with our partners in the administration to make sure that we have at our disposal tools to respond to provocations in that regard. I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals and what we would do in any particular scenario, but I will assure you that we are closely coordinating with all of our interagency partners to make sure that we will be able to respond appropriately.
Has the administration contemplated a sanctions strategy in the event of a Chinese move against Taiwan?
I'm not going to comment on specifics. We have put sanctions in China in place on China with respect to forced labor in Xinjiang and provocations with Hong Kong. But certainly we are concerned about Taiwan and will act as appropriate.
And that would include, I mean, including sanctioning senior leaders of the Chinese government, as has been done with Russia and Russian oligarchs. I mean, are you to say, am I to hear from you that you're open to all tools available in the event that China moves aggressively towards Taiwan?
Absolutely. I believe we've shown that we can. In the case of Russia, we threatened significant consequences. We've imposed significant consequences, and I think that you should not doubt our ability and resolve to do the same in other situations.
And we knew that the Russians were building 3 hospitals on the Ukrainian border. We knew they were going in, and yet we did nothing until after the fact. So my comment to you, my question to you this morning is, knowing that this was going to happen, we did nothing. We now, I think the ranking member made a comment this morning about China, knowing that they're going to go in. In fact, there's a published report in the newspapers last week that said that China was going to go into Taiwan this fall and decided not to do it. I don't know whether that report is true or not, but it was in the paper, so therefore I think we need to take it seriously. And if that's the case, are you working with the administration? Are you putting plans in place as a Treasury Secretary to come with some deterrence with sanctions right now before they get in there and not wait till after they invade Taiwan?
Well, look, we told Russia that we would impose very heavy costs on it if it invaded Ukraine. And the purpose was to deter that action. You wouldn't deter the action by putting in place sanctions before
Yes, you can, Madam Chair. With all due
something had
respect,
occurred.
You can do that. When they built the hospitals on the border, you said that's an incendiary action on your part. Therefore, we're going to do this. If you build another one, we're going to do this. If you build another one, we're going to do that. If you invade, we're going to do this. That can be done. There is a way to deter that if it's structured correctly. And my question is, are you thinking about doing this with China? Yes or no?
We are certainly working together in the administration to have in place a wide range of tools and strategies.
The ranking member of the full committee brought up the issue of a possible invasion of Taiwan. I look forward to working with him and others on this committee on a bill that would strip China of its most favored nation status or normal trade relationship with the United States automatically should there be an invasion or blockade of Taiwan.
I want to jump right into some China, World Bank, debt trap diplomacy questions, if I could. So when we think about the developing world and how we can help them develop their economies responsibly and sustainably, in many instances, countries in the developing world are choosing between different financing packages. Way too often, they're choosing China and the usurious terms that come along with that. So from a tools standpoint, what do we need either at the IFIs or the DFC to have more competitive offerings for the developing world so that they're choosing our packages over China's? And or are we even at the table when these conversations are taking place?
So I think we need the multilateral development banks to be adequately financed so they have the capacity to offer sufficient financing. There's an enormous need for infrastructure investment throughout the developing world. Countries are starved for the resources, and many don't have access to private capital markets.
So just to interrupt quickly, is your contention that these banks are not funded appropriately? Like the World Bank, IMF, they do not have adequate capital to make competitive offerings? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, in some cases, they are adequately funded. In other cases, there probably is a need for additional resources. We ourselves are in arrears, substantial arrears, in terms of meeting our own commitments and in terms of trying to generate new commitments. For example, we feel very strongly that the IMF's new Resilience and Sustainability Trust can make an important contribution to energy security and to pandemic preparedness, and Congress hasn't given us the authority to lend money to that. If the United States lends, we believe it could catalyze $100 billion from a group of countries.
Got it. And one of the problems I have with, not one of the problems, one of the issues I've been working on since I got here is Chinese influence at the IFIs, in particular the World Bank, where when I've spoken to previous executive directors of both parties, what you hear is often China has essentially bought their influence, or they've more or less bought their votes in various ways, and it makes it very difficult to defeat anything that China wants. And as a response, one of the things that I introduced and got signed into law was the Accountability for World Bank Loans to China Act. This law has various reporting requirements, but also requires the Treasury Department to advocate for a prompt end to World Bank loans to China. China historically blocks that. According to Treasury, there's been low progress on this front. Why has there been low progress, and what should we do? Well, actually, second question, do you personally believe China should graduate from the loan program at the World Bank?
Do I what?
Do you personally believe China should graduate from the loan program?
Absolutely do, and we've advocated it very strongly.
Thank you. Another provision within the enacted legislation is a report to this committee on the indebtedness of countries to China through the Belt and Road, as well as the U.S. effectiveness in promoting debt transparency at IMF and World Bank. In your estimation, how effectively are we countering China's efforts to engage in debt trap diplomacy, and how transparent are they, or how have we done in terms of getting the transparency we need to report to this committee?
You know, transparency is very important. It's a focus of both the IMF and the World Bank, and they've taken steps we all have to try to increase transparency, especially of China's lending to these countries, and we're not where we need to be on this. You know, China agreed to participate in the common framework for countries with unsustainable debt and hasn't really fully met its obligations.
Secretary Yellen, a recent study on Chinese lending by Aid Data revealed that China has established itself as the lender of first resort for many low-income and middle-income countries. China's lending terms are often less generous than those of Western and multilateral creditors, yet the multilateral development banks are not appealing enough to these countries, and they in turn turn to loans from China. China has financed hundreds of billions of dollars in development projects around the world in the last 20 years. China is not extending their funds to these countries out of kindness. They are using their financing to aggressively expand their influence around the world. So my question is, why is it that so many countries take a Chinese loan when financing from multilateral development banks is available and what are you doing to change this?
So my sense is that many developing countries would much prefer high standards, capacity building, MDB loans to Chinese loans. And it's not that they prefer Chinese borrowing to MDB borrowing, but that they really want to have access to all the financing that's available to them, and they use both. We feel very strongly, and this is part of the commitment of the president made to B3W, Build Back Better World, to helping developing countries build infrastructure in ways that involve sustainable debt, transparency, high-quality lending practices, rather than Chinese, often predatory lending practices. And I think, to make sure that we have that capacity, we need to bolster U.S. leadership in the multilateral system, and to make sure that we meet our financial obligations to these institutions. So they need to be adequately resourced, and we don't yet have confirmed executive directors, which is also important.
Okay, thank you for your response to that question. As a lead into my second question, I'd like to use our current situation with Russia as a good example of why China's influence abroad is an important issue, very important issue. In response to its aggression in the Ukraine, America responded with sanctions that will isolate and weaken Russia. Such a response does not work if we act alone. We need other countries to join our effort in order to apply more pressure to Vladimir Putin and Russia. So my concern is that with China's growing influence abroad, it would be more difficult to isolate and weaken them in the case of a Chinese military aggression. So Secretary Yellen, how concerned are you that China's lending around the world could interrupt attempts to respond to Chinese aggression?
Well, I mean, I would say generally I am concerned about Chinese lending around the world. I think, as I mentioned, I think often Chinese lending can be predatory and result in unsustainable debt and influence on countries, and that I would very much like to see the United States and its partners expand our lending in ways that diminished China's influence in this space. And of course, it is a way in which China exerts influence on many countries that borrow from it. But we need an alternative, and we need to finance it, and need a response.
Thank you. I think in my last minute, I have time for one more question. The Chinese Communist Party is carrying out what is widely acknowledged as genocide of the Uyghurs, and yet only one member of the Politburo has been sanctioned pursuant to the Global Magnitsky Act, and that individual was sanctioned during the Trump administration. Why aren't we sanctioning China's top leadership for what they're doing to the Uyghurs?
Well, we have put on sanctions of individuals who are involved in Xinjiang and the Uyghur situation. Who exactly to sanction in China is something that's part of broader foreign policy concerns that State Department plays an important role in determining, is not just a matter for Treasury.
Thank you. I just like to close by saying we need to act quickly to stop China's negative influence from growing further. Thank you. I yield back.